Welcome to this episode of Star Cells and God. My name is Fuz Rana. I am a biochemist and a Christian apologist, and I'm joined in studio today by Dr. Hugh Ross, who is an astrophysicist and a Christian apologist and a founder of Reasons to Believe, which is the organization that sponsors this podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about two discoveries that have important implications for the Christian faith. Hugh's going to be discussing an aurora event at 41,000 years ago, and what does that mean for humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans? And I'm going to be discussing the question, is ancient art depicting dinosaurs evidence for a young Earth? You don't want to miss it. Well, Hugh, it's good to see you in studio again.
Well, yes. Good to see you too, Fuz. They keep us so busy. We often don't get to see one another, even though our offices are next door to one another.
Yeah, it's true. Sometimes the only time I see you is here in the studio. But you've got a really interesting discovery about an aurora event that happened 41,000 years ago. And really, this may explain some mysteries about Neanderthal extinction and the extinction of Denisovans.
And human exceptionalism. And I picked this discovery because I think it really epitomizes what we do here at Reasons to Believe. Namely, that if you want to advance a testable creation model, it has to be interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we do, is that, we look at the different scientific disciplines, integrate the discoveries across those disciplines, and use that to advance our testable creation model. And so that's what this paper was published in Science Advances just a few days ago. And the wonderful thing about Science Advances is that they make all of their papers available to the public for free. Anybody can read them.
Yeah.
So this will be in the notes where they can check it out for themselves.
Yeah.
And the paper is quite readable. You don't have to be a technically trained scientist to read the paper. So that's another reason why I picked the discovery. And the paper beautifully demonstrates this principle of integrating across the scientific disciplines.
Yeah.
But the core of the paper is that it's about the last significant magnetic reversal. And the point they make at the beginning of the paper is that, the traditional treatment of magnetic reversals is to do it in a one-dimensional frame or a two-dimensional frame. This is the first time they've done a detailed three-dimensional computer modeling of the magnetic reversal that occurred approximately 41,000 years ago.
Okay.
And, just to give people who are not familiar with the term, the magnetic field for planet Earth today is a dipole, where the geomagnetic pole is somewhere in northern Canada. That's heading towards the North Pole right now. And that's typical when you have a dipole, that the geomagnetic pole will be relatively close to the rotation tilt axis.
Yeah.
But the magnetic field of the Earth is linked in a complex way with the solar magnetic field. And it's such that we see periodic changes in Earth's magnetic field. And what's happening is that the dipole field will change to a multipole. So instead of having a north and a south pole, you got a whole bunch of poles.
Okay.
And when that happens, the magnetic field weakens, and the region where you get auroral displays becomes bigger. And the auroral oval is called the oval where you get powerful auroral displays. It gets bigger and it moves towards the equator.
Okay.
So it goes to lower latitudes. It doesn't very often go all the way down to the equator, but it definitely goes to lower latitudes and it becomes much bigger. And with the multipole and the weaker magnetic field, that means that creatures on the surface of the Earth will be exposed to more solar radiation, especially ultraviolet radiation, because this event will affect the ozone shield of the Earth, and you get exposed to more cosmic radiation.
So how long does this reversal process take? Is it decades, hundreds of years?
Well, it can be anywhere from thousands of years to 10,000s of years. That's still considered a relatively short period of time
Right.
on a geological time scale. And about a year ago, well, more than a year ago now, I wrote an article on magnetic reversals
Mm,
because people have looked at magnetic reversals as being significant factors in the extinction of life on planet Earth.
right.
And this article I wrote basically said the time of the reversal is not long enough to play a significant role in the extinctions of life on planet Earth. Yes, the field gets weaker,
Hmm.
but it doesn't go down to zero.
Right.
Um, the weakest it could ever get is about 5% of the present value of Earth's
Mm,
magnetic field. So it means creatures would have some protection, but more typically it drops down to about 10%, which means you get significantly more protection. And what really is a factor for extinctions, at least for most species of life, is the field gets weaker, but it's how long it stays weak. And what's interesting about this paper is they make the point, yes, the magnetic reversal took 2,000 years
okay.
to go from a dipole to a multipole back to a dipole.
Now, do you always get a magnetic field reversal when this happens, or is that just something that occurs occasionally?
Well, you definitely get what's called a change from a dipole to a multipole to a dipole.
Okay.
Most frequently, you do get a flip of the magnetic field, but not always.
Okay.
But what's consistent in all cases, you go from a dipole to a multipole. When you got multiple poles, it kind of
Mm,
distributes the magnetic field, so you're going to get a weakened magnetic field.
right.
So at every magnetic reversal, you get a weakened magnetic field. But this paper is the most detailed
Mm,
description of a magnetic reversal because we're looking at the one 41,000 years ago.
mhm,
We have access to data,
mhm.
magnetic data that's better than previous ones, which enabled them to do this three-dimensional reconstruction
Right.
of what was happening with our magnetic field 41,000 years ago.
And so the data is going to be iron ore and things like that in the crust, or things compounds that would be magnetic, or
Well, this is the property of what's happening in the liquid iron core of the Earth.
okay.
I mean, what generates a magnetic field is you've got ferrous metals,
Mhm,
and the core of the Earth is almost entirely iron, nickel, and cobalt, and those are metals that are easily magnetized,
mhm,
but they have to circulate. So what creates the magnetic field is a dynamo,
right.
just like it does in a motor. So you need to have the motor rotating. And what causes the rotation of the liquid iron core is the fact you've got a solid core and you've got light elements diffusing upward
Mhm,
through that causes circulation. You get a tiny effect from the tidal friction
yeah.
from the sun and the moon, but the predominant fact is the interaction between
Right.
the solid core, the liquid core, the mantle,
Yeah.
and the crust.
But the geologists that are characterizing this magnetic field reversal are using data
The crust of the Earth,
from the
yeah.
crust of the Earth.
That's where you see the signature of what's going on in the
Right.
core of the Earth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're right on target there. And because of its recency, they're able to get
Mm,
much better data,
right.
which enabled them to do this three-dimensional
I see.
construction. What was interesting is although the reversal lasted 2,000 years, the window where creatures on the Earth are exposed to deadly ultra short wavelength ultraviolet radiation and cosmic radiation, it's just 300 years.
Mm,
So again, that explains why
mhm,
these magnetic reversals don't play a significant effect in the extinctions of life. However, what these authors basically point out, that 300-year period where you get substantial
mm,
exposure to short ultraviolet wavelength radiation and cosmic radiation would have a significant impact on three species: anatomically modern humans, that is us,
right.
the Denisovans, and the Neanderthals, because they're relatively
Mhm,
large mammals. They're active mammals, and so they have to go outside and expose themselves to this radiation.
mhm,
And they don't have a lot of hair or fur, and so their bodies are
mm,
more subject to damage
mhm,
from short wavelength radiation from the sun, and then also
mm,
from the cosmic radiation. And so they make the point in the paper that this would have substantially impacted the Denisovans and the Neanderthals
mm,
more than anatomically modern humans. And so they actually make the point in the paper, maybe this even played a major role or the critical role in the extinction of Denisovans and Neanderthals. And the data's in the ballpark.
Right.
41,000 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, other data tells us between 40 and 45,000 years ago, Neanderthals and Denisovans went extinct. And so they're saying maybe this is the thing that did it. And they also demonstrate that, very large megafauna, well, megafauna means very large animal, that they would have been to a lesser degree also impacted by this 300-year period of radiation.
Yeah.
They don't discuss this in the paper, but I find it interesting that during that 300 years, your skin's going to be exposed to things that are going to give you skin cancer, melanoma, severe sunburn. It's going to be very uncomfortable. If you ever had a bad sunburn, it's not pleasant. And if you're having that happening week after week, it can be incredibly damaging. But this will also damage the food supply. So like the crops that they're normally dependent upon for their food supply, you give them all that hard ultraviolet radiation, they're not going to grow as well. You're not going to have the food supply you normally would have. It's going to impact the food supply of the megafauna. And, we know that humans at that time were targeting megafauna for their food supply. And if they're not getting the calories and nutrition they need from the withered plants that are being impacted by this radiation, they're going to go after the megafauna. I mean, that's the most easy supply of food. And it could be that this also contributed to the collapse of several megafauna species. And the fossil record tells us it happened at about that time. So the paper is basically saying we can answer a lot of things we see in the last, 50,000 years of history for all these creatures. But the point that they're really pushing in the paper is that the reason why anatomically modern humans survived quite well through this phenomena is they had access to technology that the Denisovans and Neanderthals did not have. And they point out, for example, that you see in the artifacts that date to 40 to 45,000 years ago for anatomically modern humans is that they were using bones to make needles with eyes in them. So they had sewing implements. They had awls so they could puncture through, hides and clothing to make buttonholes so they could tie clothes together. They had scraping instruments so that they could take animal hides and scrape them to make them into, leather that you could wear. Whereas the best case scenario for the Denisovans and the Neanderthals is they were killing megafauna and using their hides as capes. But they make the point that capes really make it difficult to hunt prey. And so if you're wearing a cape and trying to chase down a mammoth, for example, or a saber-toothed tiger, it inhibits the mobility of your arms and legs. Whereas they're pointing out that humans, anatomically modern humans, had the technology to make tailor-fitted clothing. So they could actually have pants, a shirt, shoes, etc. They could have a hat. And so that would, of course, give them significantly better protection from hard ultraviolet radiation and cosmic radiation that you wouldn't get with capes, but it meant that they could gain their food supply much more efficiently than. And in fact, a lot of anthropologists have commented the use of capes by Denisovans and Neanderthals may have been exclusively for when they were sleeping. They just kind of draped it over them. Is that given the way it inhibits mobility and your capacity to hunt, they probably put them aside. But the paper is pointing, they did try to use the capes, realizing, hey, I'm getting sunburn. I got to wear a cape. Number one, it wouldn't protect their body as well as tailored clothing. And number two, it would really inhibit their ability to get the calories and nutrients they need for food. The second thing they point out in the paper is that around 41,000 years ago, we see a big uptick in the use of ochre for cave art. And you see that literally around the world. And they said that interesting thing about this ochre that they're using for art, it's a very good sunscreen.
Mm.
And so part of the paper is just demonstrating how good of a sunscreen it is.
Mm.
And so, and they didn't mention this in the paper, but I'm thinking, you've got what, 10 grandchildren now?
12.
12 grandchildren. Wow. I remember when you had 2. It's like
Yeah.
every few months that go by, you add a couple.
Well, yep. It's the multiplication effect.
Well, Fuzz, I'm older than you and I'm still at 0. So the fact that you got 10, I'm quite envious. But the thing I notice with little children, even if they're 14 months of old, if you give them a box of crayons,
Yep.
they quickly figure out that they can use these crayons for their art.
Yeah.
And the crayons get everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And so I would apply that to this research study that, hey, if they had ochre that they were using for sunscreen, they would have quickly figured out, hey, this also is a good art material.
Yeah.
And so maybe the sunscreen came first in terms of ochre, and then the use for art came second.
Yeah.
But what they point out in the paper is the timeline is the same for both, uses sunscreen and art.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting effect.
Yeah.
And this would have been missing in the case of the Denisovans and the Neanderthals.
Yeah.
So the fact they didn't have sunscreen, the fact they didn't have tailored clothing,
Right.
and the fact that it would have been far more difficult for them to get the food they needed.
Right.
And with humans, if the plants that you're using for food, because they're getting scorched by this hard ultraviolet radiation, the fact that we can process and cook our food means that we're more able to survive
Right.
the damage in these plant food supplies than the Denisovans and Neanderthals are. And how it ties into our creation model is like, this is another powerful piece of evidence for human exceptionalism, that we have the image of God. And we can see a purpose for why God created the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. They play a role in basically training big-bodied animals, birds and mammals in particular. When you see tall bipedals with weapons in their hands, run away. And that actually helped these animals to survive when the super predator, namely us human beings, came upon the scene.
Yeah. Well, and just to be clear for people who are watching that may not be familiar with our views, is that we, take the view that Neanderthals, Denisovans, and or Denisovans, I've heard it pronounced both ways, and other hominins were creatures that had some measure of intelligence, emotional capacities. They had technology, they had culture, but they lacked the image of God. And so we expect there to be significant cognitive differences between humans and Neanderthals that reflect in humans the presence of the imago Dei and the absence of the image of God in these hominins, right? And so that the basis for human exceptionalism is the presence of the image of God.
Yeah, and that image of God explains why humans, as opposed to Neanderthals and Denisovans, you see rapid technological advance. And so with the Neanderthals, they've been here a whole lot longer. 400,000 years ago to 40 to 45,000 years ago, and you really see very little advance in their technology, if any. But with humans, they're immediately getting sewing implements. The thing I notice about humans too, we can't survive unless we process and cook our food. We don't have the jaw anatomy and the tooth structure that the Neanderthals had. So the first humans had to be able to develop the technology to process and cook food. And likewise, we don't do well running around naked. And so we had to very quickly develop the capacity for tailored clothing. That's actually something you see in Genesis chapter 3. Is that, even with Adam and Eve, they were wearing clothes. So,
well, there's an interesting study that I've seen where they were looking at the origin of body lice, because body lice is a variation of head lice, but it has to have clothing to survive, right? And so you can do genetic mapping of body lice from around the world and show that it appears to originate very close to the time that modern humans originated. So that's another indirect piece of evidence that humans were using clothing very early on, which implies that you have needle technology, which is a very sophisticated manufacturing process to make needles and then to utilize them for sewing. So it's not a trivial thing.
Yeah, and they're pointing out that Neanderthals had stone tools that they could use to scrape, say fat off of a hide.
Yeah.
But the distinction with humans is we had needles, we had awls.
Yeah.
So we could put holes in our clothing and we could sew it,
Yeah.
which is something that the Neanderthals and Denisovans were not able to do.
Yeah.
So maybe this answers the question.
Yeah.
What brought about the extinction of the Neanderthals and Denisovans and what allowed humans not only to survive but thrive during this period?
Well, it's a compelling argument that's being made here. And then I think compounding that problem would be also what we can infer about the population structure of Neanderthals. They tended to be relatively small insular groups, which meant there was high levels of inbreeding.
Right.
Which means that you're genetically weakening the population. So I think the argument that it really was a human's exceptional nature that allowed us to survive, and the fact that Neanderthals and Denisovans were not cognitively on par with humans, that probably is the explanation for their demise. But you're only compounding the problem by having a weakened genetic structure, particularly when you're seeing that kind of exposure to radiation.
Yeah, and I'm reading papers saying that probably the top population of Neanderthals was only 8,000 individuals, 15,000 at the extreme maximum, but more likely 5 to 8,000. And given that they're spread over 10 million square kilometers, that means you got very small groups.
Yeah.
Whereas with humans, you got a larger population, tribes, and therefore that's going to definitely help their survival and help the development of their technology. Yeah. I mean, you put 100 scientists together, they seem to be able to come up with stuff that 2 or 3 can't.
Yeah.
So,
well, and this is also significant in terms of how people understand Neanderthals from a Christian perspective, because there's a number of different people that are engaging the evidence from anthropology in light of the biblical account of human origins, and you have to do something with Neanderthals and the other hominins. And I think our perspective is unique, at least among major players in this endeavor, because we think Neanderthals were not like us, that they lack the image of God. We're the only group that really says it's only anatomically and behaviorally modern humans that bore God's image. But people like Bill Craig, for example, see Neanderthals as being like us, as image bearers. Young Earth creationists routinely include not only Neanderthals, but Homo habilis and, Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus in that group. So this study really, I think, damages or puts in harm's way those ideas that somehow Neanderthals were like us or that they were image bearers.
Well, that's why I picked this paper to talk to you about, because I think it's a recent paper, but it substantially argues for our point that we're distinct from the Neanderthals and Denisovans.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, more evidence that humans are made in God's image. So.
Right. Okay. Good. Let's hear about your discovery.
Yeah. Well, Hugh, this whole idea of deep fakes is becoming a real problem, right?
Oh yeah, I've experienced some of it myself, Fuz. So
yeah, where it's particularly prominent on social media, where people use deep fakes largely for malicious purposes to undermine a person's character and integrity, or suggest they're engaged in behaviors that they're not, or they've made statements that they haven't. Is used to convey misinformation. So there's a whole industry surrounding the idea of how do you recognize and identify deep fakes, and trying to teach people to do that very thing.
And some of it is humorous.
Yes, of course.
A couple of years ago, I made a deep fake of Dave Rogstad to make him look slim. And somebody did a deep fake of me where they had me with a huge head of red curly hair. So
Yeah.
You can have some fun with it.
You can have some fun with it. Yes, it can be good-natured, but unfortunately, it's oftentimes used in a malicious way. Well, this idea of being able to identify deep fakes is really critical, and it impacts a prominent argument made for young Earth creationism. And just to be clear for people that are maybe watching Star Cells and God for the first time or the first few episodes, and they're not familiar with our position, we hold to an old Earth creationist view that we take specifically a day-age interpretation of Genesis 1, where we see day as a period of time.
So we have the Earth a few billion years old,
Yep.
universe 14 billion years old.
Right.
But we have humanity relatively recent.
Yes.
It's the last of God's creation.
Yeah. That's a good
miracles.
clarifying point.
Yeah.
And we do regard Genesis 1 as a historical passage, that we see it as a divine natural history.
Historical and chronological.
Yes. Yeah. But we see the days as being periods of time, not calendar days or ordinary days.
Right.
Right. And what's remarkable is when you take that approach to Genesis 1, there's this remarkable congruence between scientifically understood history of the earth and history of life and what we see depicted in Genesis 1.
Yeah, the order is correct from that perspective.
Yeah, so that the day-age view really highlights the scientific credibility of Genesis 1. But a lot of Christians, evangelicals and conservative Christians particularly, take the view that day is actually a calendar day or an ordinary day, and that using the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 argue that, that essentially God created the earth and life on earth 6,000 years ago, or maybe upwards to 10,000 years ago, but it's a relatively remarkably recent origin of the earth, life on earth, and humanity. And so in that model, you have to now make sense of the fossil record, right? We take the fossil record as being a sampling of life's history, and we see it as reflecting divine involvement in life's history. Young Earth creationists argue it was a global, worldwide flood catastrophe that produced the fossil record. And of course, as part of that fossil record, there's innumerable dinosaur fossils. Dinosaurs are a reality that young Earth creationists must contend with. And so they argue that most of those fossils, again, were produced with the flood, that there may have been dinosaurs, at least some representatives of dinosaurs on the ark, but they didn't survive after the flood. And that means that humans and dinosaurs must have coexisted.
Right.
And so one of the lines of arguments that I've seen that even people who I consider to be reputable and credible young Earth creationists who have bona fide degrees in science will argue that evidence for humans and dinosaurs coexisting, almost said humans and Neanderthals coexisting, humans and dinosaurs coexisting, would be ancient art made by people prior to this modern day scientific understanding.
Talking about the cave art.
Dinosaurs, yeah, cave art and petroglyphs and other things like that, or pottery and things like that. But the argument is that this ancient art made by people prior to any kind of scientific knowledge of dinosaurs is in some instances depicting dinosaurs. And therefore, this is evidence that these first humans were aware of dinosaurs because they coexisted with them. And so the question is, well, how do we respond to this? Because in some instances, some of these depictions look fairly compelling, at least at first glance. And it turns out that there's a number of ways that we can respond. It's not a single response. It really is almost dependent upon the particular artifact. But there are some instances where these so-called depictions of dinosaurs are known to be forgeries. So the Acambaro figurines recovered in Mexico, the Ica stones in Peru are high-profile examples of forgeries. And we know that they're forgeries because the people who discovered these and who are then selling these artifacts for a hefty profit to tourists admitted that they were forgeries because it's illegal to sell ancient artifacts in Mexico and Peru. And so they were busted, and they confessed that they were engaged in perpetrating a fraud for a profit.
So they got a lesser sentence as a result.
Yes. Now, but the bottom line is that even if they didn't confess, we would know that there were forgeries because, for example, with the Acambaro figurines, there's some of them that are broken, but none of them are missing pieces, which is really odd, right? If these were ancient materials. Also, people ask the people that discovered these, where did you discover them? And they basically showed a site where they had some of these figurines buried. They unearthed them, but it was very evident by looking at the layers that this was disturbed, that they had placed them in there recently. And then even when you look at the carvings, there's no dirt in the crevices, which you would expect. The carving is through oxidized material as opposed to the oxidized material covering the carvings. So there's a lot of clues that these are not authentic.
Right.
Now, there are some of these depictions that are not forgeries. And in some instances, they very well could be depicting mythical creatures that just happen to look dinosaur-like. And so we can tell from the stories of the indigenous people that produced these that they had an understanding of mythical creatures as part of their mythology, and they were depicting them.
So it's kind of like their fantasy storytelling?
Yeah.
Kind of like the creatures we have in Star Wars?
Yeah. That type of thing.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And those myths may have been sacred, right? So, for some people, Star Wars is sacred, but, but, for Star Wars, it's fun.
Yeah.
And it could be that some of this was done for fun too.
Well, humans have always engaged in fantasy storytelling and literature. I mean, that's a characteristic of us human beings.
It's part of the idea that we're exceptional because we can create these imaginary worlds.
Right.
Another possibility is that these are depictions of actual animals, but they were just exaggerated. Certain features were emphasized or exaggerated. So they, again, by happenstance appear to be dinosaur-like.
And we see that in other depictions of cave art as well.
Yeah.
So it's like, not all art is the same.
Yeah, exactly. And then in some instances, the argument is that, well, what people are seeing is actually not even an animal, but you're seeing patterns in the art that isn't actually truly depicting a dinosaur. Like it may be pictures of people on cave walls where by looking at it in a certain way, it looks like it's a dinosaur. Very similar to somebody seeing the outline of Jesus's face on a piece of toast, right? That could be something going on. And so, these are some of the common responses that I see, which are legitimate responses. And it's interesting because just a few days ago, we're recording this in mid-May, so about a week ago, there was a paper published on the CMI website.
Christian Ministries International.
Yes, thank you. Their website is creation.com, and it's written by a guy.
And these are young Earth creationists.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's written by a guy named Keaton Haley, who wrote an article basically arguing that at least 12 examples of dinosaurs depicted in ancient art are illegitimate for many of the reasons we've just described.
Right.
And so he points out that as a matter of integrity, we need to acknowledge that these are really not bona fide examples of humans and dinosaurs coexisting. Now, in the article, he leaves the implication that some of them are legitimate.
Right.
Right. And that he's not denying humans and dinosaurs didn't coexist, but he's saying for the sake of integrity, we need to acknowledge this. Now, I appreciate that very much, that he should be applauded, CMI should be applauded. But there's something that concerns me at a deeper level about this is not the first time I've seen young Earth creationists acknowledge that an argument for a young Earth actually turns out to be a poor or invalid argument. In fact, I've been involved in apologetics easily for 30 years. I've been involved here for 25 years. And over that 30-year period of time, I've seen more and more instances where young Earth creationists, and again, you applaud their integrity, have said, this argument that we are making isn't valid, right? This is the trend line. It's not fewer and fewer examples, it's more and more examples because there's so much pressure exposing the invalidity or the weakness of the arguments that they're making.
The problem, though, and this is probably where you're going, is that they are admitting that it's invalid. They're not admitting that the fact that it is invalid is catastrophic to their interpretation
Yes.
of science and
Right.
scripture.
Right.
That's something I've seen too over the past 35 years,
Yeah.
is that the admission only goes so far.
Yeah. Now, there are, though, some instances where the depictions of dinosaurs seem to be compelling and where you can't dismiss them. To be fair to Keaton Haley, you can't dismiss them as just simply forgeries or mythical creatures or exaggerated images, but they seem to be bona fide. And this leads to another response to this challenge that, to me, is provocative in its additional evidence for human exceptionalism, and that is that it could very well be that these ancient artists actually had an awareness of creatures like dinosaurs, not because they lived with them, but because they had discovered dinosaur footprints and dinosaur fossils. And so I've got an image of a paper that was published in 2005, where these researchers were looking at art produced by Bushmen in South Africa. And they noted that this cave art appeared to be depicting these bird-like dinosaurs. And they noted that there's actually near the cave these Jurassic layers that are known to be loaded with fossils. And so the thought is these Bushmen discovered—
They were paleontologists.
Yeah, they discovered these fossils.
Right.
They have such an awareness of their world. They were so in tune with nature and with the creatures in the world that they could actually do reconstructions from footprints and from fossil remains as to what these creatures would have potentially looked like. And so they're depicting dinosaur-like creatures because they, and in fact, in this paper, I think they coined the term that these people were indigenous paleontologists, and that these reconstructions were comparable to the reconstructions done by modern-day paleontologists. Another paper just published a few months ago, this paper I just referred to was in 2005.
Right.
Just about a year ago, there was a paper published in PLOS 1 where, again, they were looking at sites in South Africa. These were sites, cave art made by the Karoo. There's a particular cave system where there is this panel called the serpent panel, where there are these serpents that are depicted, but the head of the serpent doesn't look like a snake. It looks completely different than a snake. And it turns out that they believe that this is a depiction of a dicynodont, right, which is not technically a dinosaur, but was an ancient creature that would have existed in the distant past. And again, this cave is near Jurassic layers where there are these dicynodont fossils in them. And they actually show, here's the fossil, here's a fossil from the site, and this is what the head looks like. It's a remarkable depiction.
So it's demonstrating that ancient humans were not only doing paleontology in the context of dinosaurs, they were doing paleontology for a wide spectrum of creatures that have gone extinct.
Right. Now, these two studies, again, are suggesting very strongly that there was an indigenous paleontology.
Right.
Now, but they're an inference, right? Because you don't have direct evidence that these people knew about dinosaurs. You're just inferring it because of the closeness of fossil remains. So there's another paper published, and this one was in Scientific Reports. So this is a Nature publication where they were looking at dinosaur footprints in northern Brazil. And they noted that adjacent to these footprints were petroglyphs, where in fact the humans that produced the petroglyphs were incorporating the dinosaur footprints into the petroglyphs, that it was becoming incorporated into the art. So this is direct evidence that these people actually knew about dinosaur footprints. They may not have known they were dinosaurs, but they knew that they were made by creatures that probably were not what they were familiar with in their world, to the point where they saw them as being so significant that they built art adjacent to it and even incorporated them into the art.
What's reasonable about that, they would have seen these footprints, noticed the enormous size of the footprints, and recognized this had to be imprinted by a really big creature. And given the size of this creature, that would have easily gone into their fantasy literature,
Yeah.
their artwork, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. So the bottom line is that there are good reasons to think that this ancient art, that's depicting dinosaurs is not truly evidence that humans and dinosaurs coexisted. And of course, young earthers who are making this argument are completely ignoring or rejecting the tons of radiometric dates that we have for when dinosaurs lived, when the very first humans lived, modern humans lived. It's very clear that dinosaurs existed 225 million years ago, went extinct 65 million years ago. There's very clear eras of different types of dinosaurs, the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous.
Well, the other thing our young Earth creationist friends are ignoring is the geological conditions you need for creatures that big to exist. They can't exist on Earth like it is today. They can only exist when you got these vast, shallow seas. I mean, at one time, half of North America was a vast, shallow sea. And we're talking like, 10 to 40 feet depth of water. And that depth of water would have provided the necessary buoyancy for creatures that big to exist. But you can't have creatures that big without extensive water buoyancy. Yeah. So if all you got are a few lakes, it's not going to work. You need these shallow seas that are covering millions of square kilometers where these creatures can roam around and get their food. And also explains how a creature like T-Rex could survive. They're basically in water and hunting creatures that are in water. And so its huge height and body mass wouldn't be a problem. But if you don't have conditions like that, you can't have creatures like that. So,
yeah.
And, if you have these vast, shallow seas, that's not good for humans.
Yeah.
So trying to argue that they cohabited, it's like we humans need different geographical and geological features on the Earth than these big dinosaurs does. From a geological reason alone, it doesn't make sense that they could cohabit.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So very good reasons to reject that young Earth claim. And, and so the bottom line is that even though there are these arguments that superficially seem compelling at first glance, just even a little bit of pressure on the argument, putting the argument under scrutiny even a little bit, really exposes problems with the young Earth argument.
Let me press
in this
a
case.
bit, because you talked about 3 papers. It seems like what the papers are saying, we find this art that's remarkably close to depicting what these dinosaurs are like, but only at sites where there's bones that these people and footprints that they would have been familiar with.
Yes.
And I think another thing our young Earth friends are not taking into account is just how ubiquitous dinosaur footprints and bones are.
Yes.
They're all over the world. I mean, I remember taking a vacation with our 2 sons when they were young and said, we're going to take you to some dinosaur sites. And the thing that stunned them is there's no fence here. There's no admission charge. And it says, because this stuff is just so common, there's so much of it, they don't even bother putting up a sign. They don't even bother trying to put a fence around to protect it or worried about people stealing stuff. Yeah. There's just way too much of it. And I remember the time when we were in a part of Utah, and I said, well, here's some dinosaur footprints. They said, Dad, this print is almost 2 feet across and 2.5 feet deep. And it's like, well, now you know how big this creature had to be. The fact that they were stunned by the footprint that they saw and on the number of footprints like that, I mean, I can imagine when humans first saw those things, it's like, what are we seeing here?
Yeah.
It's like, this is clearly a footprint.
Yeah.
And this creature has to be really enormous.
And they would have had a very good understanding of the catalog of footprints for animals that they would have lived with.
Right.
And so you're not going to just simply create petroglyphs, which are massive in size in some instances that are hard to produce, just simply for a common footprint. There's got to be something exceptional
Right.
that motivates you to see this as so significant that you're now going to build an art installation around it.
Yeah, it's also another argument for our exceptionalism is when we see something extraordinary like that in nature,
Yeah.
whether it be the Milky Way or it be a gigantic footprint, it motivates us to
Yeah.
begin to express that in our art and our literature.
Yeah. Well, it also highlights the fact that we really want to be careful about having recency bias, to think that because we live in a modern age with modern science, that we somehow have an upper hand on people that didn't have the technology prior to us. The people that lived in the past, even when humans appear, 130,000 years ago, were just like us. They may not have had the same technology, but they were just like us in every sense of the word, right? And so this highlights, again, not only the exceptional nature of people that lived in the past in a historic time frame, but also that even indigenous people today are exceptional in their own way, that they have an understanding of their world that we probably don't even come close to appreciating as people that live in urban settings.
Yeah, they weren't stupid. They were intelligent.
Yeah.
I mean, just a few months ago, Kathy and I took a vacation in Britain where we visited all these stone observatories.
Yeah.
And what stunned Kathy was, look how many of them there are.
Yeah.
Just on a couple of islands in Scotland. And says, this is the way it was all over the world. We now know there were thousands of these rather technically advanced stone observatories that ancients were using to actually do their cosmology. So they were just as interested in science as we are, probably more so, because they're more in tune with the nature. They weren't living indoors to the degree we do today. And this idea, I like what you said. There's this bias today that we're smarter, more technically and logically advanced, and we tend to look down on the ancients. We need to stop doing that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Hugh. I'm going to bring everything to a close. Thank you so much for joining us today on Star Cells and God. We would love for you to join the discussion in the comments below. And remember to like this video and to subscribe for more content. New episodes of Star Cells and God release every Wednesday and are available here on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Be sure to share this video with a friend, and remember, the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe in the God of the Bible.